The first thing I did after dying was try to put someone in a chokehold. In my defense, I'd spent 6 years as a paramedic waking up to strangers grabbing my arm, combative patients, panicked family members, one memorable incident involving a golden retriever and a defibrillator. My body had exactly one setting for unfamiliar hands on me before I'm fully conscious, and that setting was control the airway, control the threat. So when I opened my eyes under a ceiling made of hand-carved wood, in a bed the size of my old studio apartment, and a man in a black suit leaned over me murmuring, "Sir, you're awake. I should call." I grabbed his wrist, rolled, and had my forearm across his windpipe before either of us understood what was happening. "Mr. Bennett," he wheezed, which was not helpful, because I had no idea who Mr. Bennett was, and several very insistent alarm bells were going off in my skull, informing me that Mr. Bennett was, apparently, me. Here is a short introduction, since new information kept arriving whether I wanted it or not. Eli Bennett, 24, Omega. Soft brown hair, gray eyes, a face that had clearly never once in its life needed to talk someone down from a psychotic break at 3 a.m., and according to the wedding band cutting into my finger, married. I let go of the guard's throat. He staggered back into a vase worth more than my student loans and knocked it into a wall of windows overlooking a garden that belonged in a magazine. "I am so sorry," I said, to the vase mostly. Muscle memory. It's a whole thing. The guard, early 30s, buzz cut, a Boston accent thick enough to spread on toast, stared at me like I'd grown a second head. "You've never done that before." "First time for everything," I said, and meant it more literally than he could possibly know. Because 40 seconds earlier, I had been Daniel Reyes, 29 years old, riding in the back of a rig on I-90 in a downpour so hard the wipers couldn't keep up, doing compressions on a 60-year-old man having a massive MI while my partner Theo fought the wheel. I remembered headlights. I remembered the trailer jackknifing across 3 lanes. I remembered thinking, with the calm, detached clarity that comes right before your brain shuts off self-preservation, well, at least the patient's going to make it. Somebody's already calling it in. And then I remembered nothing, and then I remembered everything, except none of it was mine. A private wing. A cream card on the nightstand with 7 numbered rules on it, like a hostage manual disguised as etiquette. A younger brother named Milo, who called every Sunday and hated cafeteria food. A husband named Nathaniel Callahan, who ran, according to the memories flooding in like water through a cracked window, one of the last real crime families left on the East Coast, and a scrawled, half-erased note on the back of the rule card, in handwriting that wasn't quite steady, "Protect Milo." Vance knows I found the accounts. I looked up from the card to find the guard still staring at me, one hand hovering near his radio. "You should rest," he said carefully, "the way you talk to someone standing on a ledge. I'll get the housekeeper to bring breakfast." "Great," I said. "While she's at it, can somebody explain why I apparently married a man rich enough to own a vase room?" Honestly, my first real instinct, underneath the confusion, underneath the very reasonable question of whether I'd lost my mind, was to close my eyes and go back to sleep until the universe sorted itself out without me. 6 years of overnight shifts had taught me that most crises look a lot less urgent after a nap. This one, unfortunately, declined to wait. He didn't answer. He never got the chance, because that was the exact moment the door opened and Nathaniel Callahan walked in, and every single thought in my head, mortality, murder investigations, my own funeral, the 60-year-old man I'd definitely failed to save, evaporated like mist off hot asphalt. Quick aside before we keep going, if you're already hooked, go ahead and hit that follow button now. This one only gets better from here, and you'll want to catch the rest. Nathaniel Callahan, 34. Alpha. Head of the Callahan family, which had run freight, favors, and fear along the Boston waterfront for 3 generations. 6'3" of tailored charcoal wool, and the specific bone-deep stillness of a man who had never once in his adult life needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. His gray eyes swept the room, broken vase, guard rubbing his throat, me standing in the middle of it in a silk robe I did not remember putting on, and settled on me with an expression I can only describe as cataloging. "You're standing," he said. "No hello, no how are you feeling. Just an observation, delivered like a verdict." Fantastic detective work. Something flickered behind his eyes, not quite surprise. More like a man recalibrating an instrument that had suddenly started reading numbers it wasn't built for. "You were told to stay in bed." Was I? Funny, Because I remember being told to stay in bed, and yet here I am, standing. I gestured at myself, robe and all. It's almost like being told things doesn't automatically make them true. For what it's worth, I genuinely love to go back to bed. This just didn't feel like a lying down kind of morning. The guard made a small, strangled noise and found something extremely interesting to look at on the carpet. Nathaniel's jaw did something complicated. For one full second, I thought I'd miscalculated, that I was about to learn, the hard way, what it looked like when a Boston crime boss decided his fragile Omega husband had lost his mind overnight. Instead, the corner of his mouth twitched. Not a smile. The idea of one, filed away for later. "You didn't use to talk to me like that," he said. "People change," I said, which was, technically, the understatement of 2 lifetimes. He crossed the room. Not fast, not slow, the unhurried walk of a man who had never once needed to catch up to anything, and stopped close enough that I had to actually tip my head back to keep looking at him. Up close he smelled like cedar and gun oil and, faintly, coffee, which was such a normal human detail that it caught me off guard more than the suit or the scars on his knuckles did. "You broke a vase," he said. "The vase started it." "The vase," Nathaniel said very evenly, "did not have a security detail assigned to protect it from you. Then the vase and I have that in common, because apparently I also have a security detail assigned to protect me from me, according to the 7-item terms of service agreement I woke up to." I held up the cream card. "Rule 1, do not leave the private wing without permission. I left the private wing 4 minutes after I woke up and nobody's arrested me yet, so either the rule's a suggestion or your security's slacking." I watched it land. Watched him actually think about it instead of simply overriding me. The way every memory Eli Bennett had left behind told me powerful men in this house always had. "You read the whole list," he said slowly, "and the thing you're upset about is Rule 1. I'm upset about several things. I'm working through them chronologically. It's more efficient." For one dizzying second, Nathaniel Callahan, Mafia boss, terrifying, 6'3" of quiet menace, looked like he was fighting the urge to laugh, and lost the fight badly enough that a single short exhale of air escaped through his nose before he caught it and smoothed his expression back into granite. "There it is," said a small, unhelpful part of my brain that had apparently transmigrated along with the rest of me. "That's the moment. Remember that one." Out loud, all I said was, "So, are you going to tell me what's actually going on, or am I supposed to solve this like an escape room?" Nathaniel studied me for a long moment, the kind of look I imagined he gave financial statements before deciding whether to burn someone's life down over them. "My office," he said. 10 minutes. Get dressed first, preferably in something that isn't a robe you're clearly plotting an assassination in." "No promises," I said, and had the deep, petty satisfaction of watching him pause at the door, like he genuinely couldn't tell if I was joking. I wasn't entirely sure either. Old habits, as it turned out, transmigrated just fine. Getting dressed took longer than it should have, mostly because Eli Bennett's closet was by side of my old apartment's kitchen, and none of it made sense to hands that used to live in cargo pants and department-issued boots. I found jeans eventually, and a soft gray sweater, and, tucked in the inside jacket pocket of a coat I didn't remember owning, a folded receipt with a single word underlined in pencil: Harbor. Evan's Memories, because that was the name that kept surfacing under Eli's, the way you sometimes hear an old radio station bleed through a new one, arrived less like recollection and more like watching someone else's home movies through a rain-streaked window. A parking lot outside a college dorm. A younger man laughing about cafeteria mystery meat. A black sedan parked across the street that didn't belong, and a voice in a hallway, warm and reasonable and absolutely terrifying. "Your brother has a promising future. It would be unfortunate if financial complications interrupted it." There was also, tucked between 2 sweaters that had never once been worn, a paperback mystery novel with a receipt used as a bookmark on page 112, and a note in the margin in the same careful pencil hand. "N. doesn't know I read these. Thinks I only read the reports he leaves out for me. Let him think that." I stood there a second longer than I meant to, absurdly, unexpectedly touched by the idea of a man so thoroughly boxed in by rules that hiding a cheap paperback felt like an act of rebellion. Whoever Evan Parker had been, he hadn't been broken. He'd been rationed. There was a difference, and I intended to make sure everyone in this house learned it. I stood very still in the closet for a moment, receipt in hand, and understood 2 things with total clarity. 1. I hadn't woken up into a stranger's life. I'd woken up into the middle of somebody's unfinished war. 2. Whoever Preston Vance was, he had made a serious tactical error, because he was still operating under the assumption that the frightened young man he'd spent years quietly cornering was the same person standing in this closet now. I'd spent 6 years, most of my adult life, before a wet highway and bad brakes ended it, learning how easy it was for people to underestimate someone who looked soft. It had saved my life more times than any piece of equipment ever had. It was about to save someone else's. Before any of that, though, there was breakfast, and breakfast very nearly ended my second life before it properly started. MRS. Alvarez. 60-something, the housekeeper, built like someone who had personally raised 4 sons and buried 0 patience for nonsense in the process. She set a tray down in the private wing's sitting room with the wary energy of a woman handling an unexploded device. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "eggs, toast. You should eat before you decide to break anything else. That was 1 vase. That was 1 vase today." She folded her arms. "You feeling all right? You've got a look on your face like you're casing the room." I glanced down and realized I had, in fact, been quietly counting exits. 2 doors, 1 window with a decent drop to a garden bed, a fire escape ladder visible through the east window, the exact habit that used to earn me free coffee from every gas station clerk in a 6-block radius of my old station, back when they'd learned to recognize the guy who always stood facing the door. "Force of habit," I said. "I promise the eggs are safe. Also, I would very much like to eat them sitting down and not think about a single security concern for the next 10 minutes, if the universe would allow it." "The eggs," she said, "were never in question. You, on the other hand." She studied me a second longer, head tilted, the way people who've worked in a house full of secrets for 20 years learn to study things. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled, small and real. "You've got more color in your face than you've had in months. Whatever's different about you. I'll take it." She left before I could figure out how to respond to that, which was probably for the best, because thank you, I recently died and woke up as your employer's husband wasn't an opener I'd workshopped yet. I ate the eggs. They were, in fact, excellent, and I said so out loud to absolutely nobody, and then caught myself doing it, thanking an empty room out of a habit built from years of thanking rigs, coffee machines, and the particular ambulance bay vending machine that never once in 6 years ate my dollar, and had to sit with the strange, dislocating grief of realizing that habit belonged to a version of me currently very, very dead. I gave myself exactly 90 seconds to feel sorry about that. 90 seconds was, historically, my professional limit before a patient needed me focused instead of feeling things. Then I finished the toast, pocketed the receipt with Harbor underlined on it, and, with considerable reluctance, because some small, stubborn part of me still wanted nothing more than to crawl back into that enormous bed and let somebody else handle the crime family for a while, went looking for whatever came next. I found my way downstairs using a memory that wasn't mine and a paramedic's instinct for floor plans, and ran directly into a man in a navy suit whose smile arrived a half-second too fast to be real. "Mr. Bennett," he said, "you're looking well. Preston Vance. 45. Nathaniel's consigliere for 12 years. The man everyone in this house deferred to on instinct, the way you defer to weather. Silver at the temples, a voice built for boardrooms, and eyes that did a very fast, very thorough inventory of me, before his smile widened another careful degree. "I feel great," I said. "Best morning of my life, actually. Well, one of them." Something in his expression paused, recalibrated. "You seem different today. Everyone keeps saying that." I smiled back at him, the exact wattage of a man with nothing to hide. "Maybe I finally got enough sleep." "Nathaniel dislikes unnecessary complications," Vance said, light as a threat wrapped in silk. Then he picked an interesting family business. The smile didn't move. His hand did, a half-inch toward the watch on his wrist, stilled almost before it started. Almost nothing. In my old life, almost nothing was frequently the entire difference between a call that ended peacefully and one that didn't. "Careful, Eli," he said softly, using the name like it was a leash. "I usually am," I said. "You'd be amazed how careful." I left him standing in the hallway with his smile still on, and his eyes doing math he didn't like the answer to, and went to find my husband's office, already fairly certain that whatever Preston Vance thought he understood about the man he'd cornered for years, he was about to be spectacularly, catastrophically wrong. Nathaniel's office looked exactly like I'd expected. Dark wood, a wall of windows facing the harbor, a desk clean enough to perform surgery on, except for the one detail that didn't fit, a small, half-dead succulent on the windowsill that someone had clearly forgotten to water for weeks, and someone else had clearly, stubbornly, kept trying to save anyway. "You're late," Nathaniel said, not looking up from a folder. "I got cornered by your consigliere in the hallway. Nice guy. Very smiley." I don't trust him even slightly. That got his attention. He set the folder down. Most people trust Preston immediately. Most people haven't spent their lives learning what it looks like when someone's smile doesn't reach anywhere near their eyes. I dropped into the chair across from him without waiting to be invited, which I got the distinct impression nobody in this house ever did, based on the way his eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. So, rules. 7 of them. Number 3 says I'm not supposed to interfere with security. I'm going to interfere with security. Excuse me? Your east entrance camera's angled too high. It's covering the roofline instead of the service path. There was an unattended delivery sitting there for almost 4 minutes this morning. Your duty schedule's changed twice this month without the house manager being told, which means somebody's rearranging your guards without your knowledge. And the guy stationed outside my wing spends more time on his phone than watching the monitor he's supposed to be watching. I ticked it off on my fingers like a chart handoff at shift change. That's not a security detail. That's a liability with a badge. Silence. Long enough that I started to wonder if I'd finally, actually, catastrophically misjudged the room. "You never cared about security before," Nathaniel said slowly. There it was. The real question, wearing a statement's clothes. "Maybe I cared and stopped believing anyone would listen," I said, which was truer than he could know, in a way that belonged to somebody else's memories and not mine, and watched something shift behind his eyes. Not suspicion, exactly. Recognition of a door he hadn't known was closed. He picked up his phone without another word and made a call that had his security chief auditing camera coverage, guard rotations, and the last 30 days of access logs inside of 90 seconds, using a tone that made it very clear this was not a request. When he hung up, he looked at me the way you look at a piece of equipment that's just started doing something it wasn't designed to do. "What else?" he said. Not a question. An opening. I thought about the receipt in my pocket and the note on the back of the rule card, and a boy named Milo laughing in a parking lot while a black sedan idled across the street. "Your husband found something," I said, watching his face very carefully. "Before whatever happened to him, before whatever's different about me now, he found records. Payments. Your brother-in-law's tuition and rent and insurance are all routed through a company called Vance Advisory Group." Nathaniel went very still, the particular stillness of a large predator deciding whether it heard something correctly. "Say that again." "Preston's company is paying for your husband's little brother's life," I said. "That's not generosity, Nathaniel. That's a leash with a bow tied on it." For a moment, neither of us moved. Rain had started against the windows sometime in the last hour, soft and steady, and somewhere in the house a clock I couldn't see was ticking loud enough to fill the silence. "How do you know this?" Nathaniel said, very quietly, "when even I didn't know this." I met his eyes and didn't look away, which, I was starting to understand, the more Evan's memories bled through, was itself something new in this house. "Because somebody left me a trail," I said, "and I intend to finish it." By 9 that morning, I'd learned the estate had 3 kinds of people: the ones who followed Nathaniel's rules, the ones who enforced them, and the ones who'd figured out how to weaponize them for something else entirely. I spent the next hour asking careless, harmless questions. Which hallway leads to the garden? Does Milo still get mail here? Who handles the family's personal expenses? The kind of questions a soft, sheltered Omega husband might ask out of boredom. Nobody suspected I was mapping the building. Nobody except Preston Vance, who found reasons to be near me twice more before lunch, each time smiling a little less convincingly. I found the rest of the trail exactly where Evan's memories told me it would be. Page numbers penciled beside dates on old receipts, corresponding to underlined words in books nobody else had touched in years. March, tuition, harbor, second account. A code simple enough to survive a casual search and thorough enough to hold up under a real one. The trail ended at a message on Eli's phone, 3 weeks old, from a number saved under Milo, a turtle emoji, for reasons I decided not to investigate, that read, Vance says I should thank him for keeping everything stable. I'd key why, but it kinda freaks me out. I read it twice. Somebody had been trying to protect a scared kid from a man who used kindness like a scalpel, and nobody in this entire fortress of a house had been listening. A memory rose up without warning, sharp enough to steal the room out from under me. Evan, standing outside this office with printed records pressed to his chest, rehearsing the same sentence 3 times under his breath. Nathaniel, I need to show you something. Before he could knock, Preston Vance had appeared in the hallway, smiling that same smile. Milo's tuition is expensive, isn't it? It would be a shame if a misunderstanding affected so many people, and Evan's hand had fallen away from the door. The memory faded, but the fear it left behind didn't. I stood in the hallway with my own. His heart beat too fast in my chest and thought, with a clarity that felt entirely like my own. Nobody's hand is falling away from anything again. Not on my watch. In my old life, I'd run toward burning buildings and highway pileups because somebody had to, because hesitation cost lives, because the job wasn't done until the patient was stable. This didn't feel any different. It just came with better furniture and considerably worse security. The night before the dinner, I found Nathaniel in the small den off the kitchen. Not the office, not the library, a room with a couch that had clearly seen actual use, and a chessboard set up on the coffee table with half the pieces missing their proper places, like someone had started a game, gotten interrupted, and never come back to finish it. "You play?" I asked. "Badly," he admitted without looking up. "Milo taught me during a school break 4 years ago. He's better than me and never lets me forget it. Move over." He looked up, surprised, and moved over. I was, it turned out, also badly out of practice. Daniel Reyes hadn't played chess since a slow overnight shift in his 2nd year taught by an ER doc who liked to gloat, but muscle memory for strategy, it seemed, survived death about as well as muscle memory for chokeholds. I opened aggressively. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "That's reckless. That's confident." "There's a difference, is there? Ask me again in 6 moves. Also, full disclosure, if you take longer than 60 seconds a turn, I will fall asleep sitting up. I've done it before. It's not personal. It took 8 moves, and he won, and looked entirely too pleased with himself about it for a man who'd described his own skill level as badly. You lied about being bad at this. I'm bad relative to Milo. I am, apparently, adequate relative to you. The corner of his mouth curved, unmistakably smug, and it did something unfair and distracting to my ability to form a comeback. Rematch? Obviously, though I want it on record that I'm choosing effort here. This is not my default setting. We played 2 more games. I won the second, mostly through sheer stubbornness, and one gambit he clearly hadn't been braced for. He won the third, cleanly, and didn't gloat about that one at all, just reset the board afterward like he was already thinking about the next one. And somewhere in the middle of it, without either of us deciding to, the conversation drifted somewhere quieter. "Can I ask you something?" he said, eyes on the board, not on me, which I was starting to understand was how he asked the questions that actually mattered to him. "Sure." "Are you happy? Here. Now. Whatever now means for you." I turned a captured pawn against the easy one, and decided, somewhere in the last week, that I owed this house at least one honest thing a day. "I don't know yet," I said. "I know I'd rather be figuring it out here than anywhere else I can currently imagine. Ask me again once nobody's trying to poison you over dinner." "Fair," he said, and almost smiled, and reset the board one more time. "One more game," I said. "Lozer makes the other coffee tomorrow." "You don't know how to work the espresso machine in this house. It has more settings than my car." "Then I guess you'd better win." He didn't. I made truly mediocre coffee the next morning, and he drank every drop of it without complaint, which told me more about where we currently stood than any conversation could have. The dinner happened the following evening, and it was, without question, the single worst catered event I have ever attended, and I once worked a call at a wedding where the best man choked on a shrimp cocktail skewer mid-tust. 3 of Nathaniel's business associates and 2 family representatives sat around a table long enough to land a plane on, speaking politely while quietly measuring each other's net worth through their peripheral vision. Nathaniel sat at the head. Preston sat 3 sites down, radiating calm. I sat beside my husband, visible enough to be judged, underestimated enough to be useful, which, frankly, had been the story of my entire adult life even before I died in it. Then a server came in from the east hallway with a dark green bottle that didn't match anything. Every other bottle that night had a small cream inventory tag near the base. This one didn't. The seal looked newer than it should have. The route it came in on wasn't the route service staff used, and Preston Vance was watching me instead of watching the bottle, which in my professional experience was the tell that mattered more than any of the others combined. Nathaniel reached for his glass. "Don't," I said, loud enough to stop the whole table. Every fork froze. Nathaniel's hand paused an inch from the stem. Preston's smile didn't move a millimeter. "Ellie. Perhaps this isn't the moment for another security concern. That depends entirely on whether Nathaniel wants to finish dinner still breathing," I said, and turned to my husband. "No tag, new seal, wrong door. And whoever poured it is a lot more interested in whether I noticed than in whether you enjoyed it." Nathaniel didn't ask a second question. He called it in the same flat, immediate tone he'd used with the cameras. "Preserve the bottle, lock the cellar, pull every service feed. Nobody leaves this room until we know where it came from." Preston leaned back in his chair like a man mildly inconvenienced by a fire drill. "This is excessive." "Then you won't mind waiting," I said pleasantly, and had the distinct, deeply satisfying pleasure of watching his composure crack for exactly half a heartbeat before it snapped back into place, though this time, unlike the hallway that morning, he recovered fast enough to reach for his own glass and take a slow, deliberate sip, like a man proving a point nobody had asked him to prove. 20 minutes later, the toxicology screen came back. A dangerous concentration of prescription cardiac medication, dissolved into a wine designed to be sipped slowly over a 2-hour dinner. Enough, mixed with alcohol, to trigger a cardiac event that would look, to anyone not trained to catch it early, exactly like an unlucky, tragic accident. I'd spent 6 years running toward exactly that kind of accident. I recognized the shape of one from across a dinner table, the same way I used to recognize it from across an ER bay. Someone had gambled with my husband's life. And I was suddenly, furiously, very interested in making sure they lost. I found Nathaniel alone in the library an hour later, rain tracing long silver lines down the tall windows, one hand braced on the frame like he needed it to hold him up. "You were right," he said, without turning around. "I know, you enjoy saying that. Only when it's true." He laughed. Actually laughed, short and surprised, like a man rediscovering a sound he'd forgotten he owned. Then, just as fast, his face went serious again, and he turned to look at me properly, gray eyes doing that careful, cataloging thing they did. "You saved my life tonight. I noticed a mislabeled bottle. Your lab did the actual saving. The lab," he said, "didn't stand in front of a room full of dangerous people and stop me before I drank it. I didn't have a smart answer for that one, which was rare enough that I felt it land somewhere under my ribs." He took one careful step closer, close enough that I caught cedar and coffee again, close enough to see the tension finally starting to leave his shoulders, and stopped himself before he crossed whatever line he'd apparently decided existed between us. "What were you looking at?" he asked. "During dinner, you weren't watching the bottle." "No, then what?" "The room," I said. "Who you trusted, who you let get close, whose hands moved and whose didn't. Doors, staff, Preston. Nobody watches the things that actually matter. They watch the thing that's supposed to scare them and miss everything standing quietly behind it." Something shifted in his face. Not suspicion this time, but something gentler, more careful, the look of a man quietly rewriting an entire understanding of someone he thought he already knew. "The husband I married would have stayed quiet at that table," he said. He'd have apologized for the interruption before anyone else finished being scared. "People change," I said again, and this time it came out softer than I meant it to. His eyes dropped just for a second to my right hand, to a thin white scar across the knuckle that belonged to Eli, not to me. "You used to hide that hand when you were nervous," he said quietly. "Rub the scar with your thumb." A memory surfaced before I could stop it. Evan, in this same library, months earlier, Nathaniel carefully wrapping a bandage around that same knuckle after a broken glass, murmuring, "You don't have to apologize for bleeding." The memory dissolved as fast as it came, but the warmth it left behind didn't. "Did you love him?" I asked, before I could decide whether I wanted to know. Nathaniel went very still. "Yes." "Then why didn't he know it?" The answer took him a long time to find. Because I thought keeping him safe was the same thing as loving him, I mistook a locked door for an embrace. His jaw tightened. I was very good at one and terrible at the other. Outside, the rain kept falling, steady and soft, and for a moment neither of us said anything at all. Just stood there, close enough to touch, close enough that the air between us felt like it had weight, until Nathaniel cleared his throat and stepped back with the careful discipline of a man putting a loaded gun back in its holster. "From now on," he said, "if something feels wrong, you tell me. Immediately. No filtering it through anyone else. I already do." A faint, real smile this time, the first one I'd seen unguarded. "Then I'll start listening." I walked past him toward the door, and he didn't follow, and somehow the not following, the space he left for me to choose to stay or go, made me trust him more than anything he could have said. "That's the moment," said that same unhelpful little voice in the back of my head. "That's the one you'll remember." I was starting to suspect it was right. A few days before Preston's whole carefully built world finally came apart, there was a fundraising gala at the Boston Harbor Hotel, the kind of black tie event where half the guests were legitimate business people, and the other half were the specific flavor of legitimate that required a very good lawyer on retainer, and everyone in the room understood exactly which category everyone else belonged to, without a single person saying it out loud. "You don't have to come," Nathaniel had said that afternoon, adjusting his cufflinks in the mirror with the particular focus of a man bracing for a long night. "These events aren't. They're not kind to Eli historically, meaning people talk down to him, meaning people talk around him, like he's furniture that occasionally needs refilling with champagne." "Fantastic," I said, buttoning my own jacket, and privately noting that of all the things this new life had thrown at me, a formal 3-hour standing event ranked somewhere near the bottom of my personal wish list. Give me a couch and a bad movie any day. I've always wanted to be furniture. Let's go. He gave me a long, searching look in the mirror, the kind that had, over the past couple of weeks, started to feel less like suspicion and more like a man checking whether the ground under him was solid before he put his full weight on it. "You're planning something." "I'm planning to attend a party." Reluctantly, under protest. "But I'm going. Eli." "Nathaniel," I said, matching his tone exactly, and had the pleasure of watching him give up the argument with a small, resigned exhale that I was beginning to recognize as his version of fine, but I reserve the right to say I told you so. The gala was, predictably, exactly as insufferable as advertised. A man named Rourke, mid-50s, silver hair, the kind of handshake that lingers a half-second too long specifically to make a point, cornered me near the bar within 20 minutes, looked me over the way you'd examine a horse before a purchase, and said with a smile that clearly thought it was charming, "So you're the husband." Nathaniel finally domesticated something. "I prefer co-conspirator," I said. Domesticated implies I stopped biting. His smile flickered, unsure whether to be amused or alarmed, and landed somewhere unflattering to him in the middle. "I hear you've taken an interest in the family's security lately." Bold, for someone who married in. "I hear you cut your last shipment's insurance coverage by 40% right before it went missing off a container ship," I said pleasantly, having spent exactly 6 minutes that afternoon reading a folder Nathaniel had left open on his desk, which I was absolutely not supposed to have read and absolutely did not regret reading. Bold, for someone hoping nobody would notice the timing. Rourke's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Across the room, I caught Nathaniel watching us. Not moving to intervene, just watching, one eyebrow raised in an expression that I was starting to recognize as he has this handled, and I am, against every professional instinct I own, enjoying the show. That was a private matter," Rourke said, considerably less charming now. "Was it? I heard about it at a party from a man who introduced himself by insulting my marriage. Privacy's a funny thing." I took a sip of my drink. "I'd get that looked into if I were you. Before somebody less polite than me brings it up somewhere less forgiving than a fundraiser." He left within the minute, muttering something about finding Callahan, and Nathaniel crossed the room a moment later with an expression he was clearly, deliberately, keeping neutral. "You read my desk." I glanced at an open folder. "There's a difference. You just cost a man his composure in front of 40 of my associates." I redirected a man who was about to insult you to your face by making him worry about his own house instead. "You're welcome." Nathaniel studied me for a long moment, and something in his expression finally cracked into open, unguarded amusement. The real kind, the kind he clearly hadn't let anyone see in this room in years. Furniture doesn't usually do that. Told you I wasn't cut out for it. He didn't say anything else, but his hand found the small of my back as we crossed the room toward the next round of polite, terrifying conversations, light and steady and entirely unnecessary for balance, and I let it stay there for the rest of the night. Mostly because it meant I could lean on him slightly and rest my feet, which, 4 hours into a black tie event in dress shoes that were not built for standing, felt like the single laziest, most well-earned decision I'd made all week. Nathaniel found me in the sunroom 2 nights after the gala, rain tracing long lines down the glass, and closed the door behind him without locking it. Leaving the exit clear, I noticed the way he'd started doing around me without either of us ever discussing it out loud. "You're not Eli," he said, not an accusation, not even really a question. Just a fact he'd finally decided to say out loud. I didn't bother denying it. What gave it away? The chess? The vase? The part where I threatened a business associate at a party using information I stole off your desk. All of it. None of it, individually. He crossed to the window, hands in his pockets, and studied the rain instead of me, which I was starting to understand was how he managed to say difficult things at all. The man I married hated confrontation. He apologized when other people made mistakes. He noticed fear, but never the mechanics behind it. Never why a room felt wrong, just that it did. He paused. You count exits before you count furniture. You watch hands instead of faces. You've never once, not one single time, stood anywhere in this house where someone could get behind you. Occupational habit. Occupational, he repeated, and finally looked at me. What was the occupation? I told him. All of it. The rig, the highway, the rain, the 60-year-old man whose name I still remembered and whose outcome I never got to learn. 6 years of running toward exactly the kind of chaos everyone else ran from, because somebody had to, because hesitating cost people their lives, because the job wasn't finished until the patient was stable, and sometimes it wasn't finished even then. He listened without once interrupting, the particular, total stillness of a man who'd learned, the hard way, that silence sometimes did more work than questions. So, the man I married, he said finally, is... I don't know, I said before he could finish it. That's the honest answer. I have his memories. I have his handwriting on a rule card, planning to protect his brother from a man he was terrified of. I have moments that hit like my own grief, even though they're not technically mine to grieve. I don't know if he's gone, or folded into me, or somewhere I can't reach. I just know I woke up in the middle of his unfinished fight, and I wasn't about to leave it unfinished. Why not? Because somebody left me a trail on purpose, I said. That's not something you walk away from. Not in my old life. Not in this one. Believe me, part of me would love to walk away from it. That part just doesn't get a vote right now. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into something rawer than I'd heard from him yet. I failed him. Whoever he was, whatever's left of him in you. I failed him, and I didn't even understand I was doing it until it was too late to fix. You can't apologize to him, I said gently, but you can stop making the same mistake with whoever's standing in front of you now. Something in his face cracked open at that, not falling apart, just finally, fully honest, in a way I suspected didn't happen often behind these particular walls. Daniel, he said quietly, testing the shape of the old name in his mouth. I froze. Nobody had called me that since I died. Do you want me to call you that? He asked, watching me carefully, giving me every inch of room to answer honestly. My throat did something complicated. No, not yet. Then Eli, he said, like it was the easiest decision he'd made in years, until you figure out who that is. I studied him, really studied him, the way I used to study a scene before deciding whether it was safe to walk into. If you knew for certain I wasn't the man you married, would you still try to keep me here? His answer took several seconds, and I respected him more for the pause than I would have for a fast one. No, he said. I spent too long deciding what was best for him without ever once asking what he wanted. I'm not doing that again. If you stay because you choose to. If you help me finish this, it's because you choose that too. I choose to finish what he started, I said. Milo gets free of Preston. His name gets cleared. And Preston goes down with evidence nobody can bury. Nathaniel nodded, like it was already decided, which, I realized, it had been from the moment I'd caught his wrist, instead of letting him drink from a poisoned glass. Tell me what you need. What? You heard me. In my old life, powerful men only asked what I needed when they wanted to know my price. I crossed the room before I could think better of it, and caught his wrist, the same way I had that very first morning, except this time it wasn't muscle memory doing the reaching. "Thank you," as I said quietly. "For what? For believing me enough to ask instead of deciding for me." His gaze dropped to my hand on his wrist, then back up to my face, and something passed between us that neither of us had a name for yet. "You're welcome," he said, and left, and my pulse stayed too fast for a long time after the door closed. I'd run into burning buildings with a steadier heartbeat than that. Preston made his move 3 weeks after I woke up in this life, while Nathaniel was downstairs with his attorney, which told me he'd been watching for exactly that kind of gap. The security chief found me in the library, his expression carefully professional in the way people get right before they deliver news they already know you won't like. "Mr. Bennett, we found files in your study that shouldn't be there." "What kind of files?" "Internal account ledgers, access credentials, copies of Mr. Callahan's travel schedule. Too complete, too tidy." Preston hadn't planted evidence to create doubt. He'd planted that Artem Eli that everyone already believed was fragile and irrational. The husband found the accounts, panicked, stole records, and tried to sell out the family. I followed him to the study anyway, because running from a frame job is how you end up wearing it. Nathaniel was already there, and Preston stood by the window with an expression of perfectly manufactured disappointment. "I warned you Eli was becoming unpredictable," Preston said, not even bothering to look at me first. "That's your first mistake," I said, and he finally did look, one eyebrow rising a precise, practiced fraction. "Excuse me? You're still talking about the man you spent years teaching this whole house to underestimate. If those files are mine, let the evidence prove it." I turned to Nathaniel. "I haven't even been conscious 3 weeks. I've barely learned where the good coffee is kept." Rene Okafor. Nathaniel's attorney, sharp-suited, entirely unbothered by the tension in the room, the kind of woman who had clearly spent her entire career being underestimated in rooms full of men exactly like Preston and had stopped finding it interesting years ago. She stepped forward with a tablet already in hand. "For the last 48 hours, access logs, keycard activity, and camera backups have been mirrored to an independent server outside the estate network. The study cabinet was opened at 6:42 this morning using an administrative override. Several people have administrative access," Preston said, a shade too fast. "Not for the last 48 hours, Renee said pleasantly. "That credential traces to Vance Advisory Group." The room went very quiet. Preston's smile finally fully cracked. "Why Milo?" I asked. "His tuition, his rent, his insurance. Why him?" Preston didn't answer, which was, in its own way, the loudest answer possible. "Because Eli would do anything for him," Nathaniel said, voice dropping into something colder than I'd heard from him yet. "You used my husband's brother to keep him quiet." "I kept this family stable," Preston snapped, composure finally, fully gone. "You wake up one morning playing at being someone new, turning Nathaniel against people who built this family before you knew how any of it worked." "How long have you known I was different?" I asked, tilting my head, watching him with the same clinical attention I used to give a patient's vitals when something wasn't matching the chart. "Long enough. And the wine?" Nathaniel took one single step forward, and Preston's eyes flicked to him and finally lost their nerve. "I never wanted him dead," Preston said. "I calculated the dose. He was supposed to collapse. A reminder of what happens when outsiders get too comfortable interfering. Nothing permanent. You gambled with my life," Nathaniel said quiet as I held breath, "because you decided you understood the limits of my own heart better than I did." "After 12 years, Preston said, voice cracking now, "you're choosing him over me?" "No," Nathaniel said, and it landed like a verdict. "I'm choosing evidence over a loyalty that was never real to begin with." Security moved in. Preston's gaze found mine as they took his phone and his access card, and for 1 second the smile came back, thin and furious. "I know what you are," he said. "So do I said. "That's the difference between us." The door closed behind him, and the room exhaled all at once, like a held breath finally let go. Nathaniel looked at me across the wreckage of his own consigliere's 12-year career and said, entirely deadpan, "I'm going to need a new person to lose chess to." "Absolutely not. I'm keeping that job. It's the only thing in this house I'm objectively bad at, and frankly, it's a relief." That got the first real, unguarded laugh out of him I'd heard all week, the kind that softened every line in his face at once. And for one small, ordinary moment, standing in a room that had just watched a 12-year betrayal collapse in real time, We just stood there and let ourselves be a little bit ridiculous about it. The next morning, Nathaniel called 3 senior advisors into the conference room, along with a folder thick enough to double as a doorstop. Walter Higgins, 60-something, the kind of old guard advisor who'd clearly been in this family since before Nathaniel could walk, looked at me with something close to shame. "We thought Eli was unstable," he said. "We were told he imagined threats." "He didn't imagine a single thing," I said. Nathaniel stood at the head of the table, and something in his voice when he spoke made every person in that room sit up straighter. Every note in this family's records calling Eli Bennett irrational, unreliable, or emotionally compromised gets corrected. Today, his warnings were legitimate. His messages were intercepted. His concerns were buried by a man I trusted more than I trusted my own instincts. Something tightened in my chest that had nothing to do with adrenaline. Somewhere in the last few weeks, people had built a locked door out of a scared, careful man's reputation, and Nathaniel was finally publicly taking it apart with his bare hands. Detectives arrived that evening once Renee handed over the poisoning evidence, the financial trail, and every preserved log. Preston Vance was walked out through the front foyer in handcuffs while the staff watched, and this time nobody lowered their eyes. That, I decided, was a better punishment than anything I could have engineered myself back when I still would have reached for something sharper than paperwork. Milo arrived that same night, ushered off campus by Renee's office, with a gentleness I doubted he understood the reason for yet. He stopped dead in the foyer when he saw me. Milo Bennett, 20, a sophomore at Boston College, the kind of kid who still texted his brother a turtle emoji for no reason anyone had ever bothered to explain. "Is it over?" he asked. "The part where Vance controls your life." "Yes. My tuition, independent trust. Nothing routed through him ever again. My apartment, lease is in your name now. Insurance too. No Vance company anywhere near either one." His shoulders dropped about 4 inches all at once. "So he can't take anything away. No." He crossed the room and hugged me hard enough to lift me half an inch off the floor, and for one dizzying second, Evan's feelings and mine tangled together so completely I couldn't tell which of us was holding on tighter. "You were scared," Milo mumbled into my shoulder, "when you called me after that dinner. You sounded really scared." I'd been terrified of failing someone Evan loved, which, I was starting to understand, had somehow, quietly, become the same thing as being terrified of failing someone I loved too. "Whatever's different about you," Milo said, leaning back, giving me a shaky, watery laugh. "You're still my brother where it counts. Also, you're acting super weird, and I want the full story eventually, but I'll take safe for now." "Deal," I said, and meant every word of it. That night, Nathaniel asked me to meet him in the library. No guards, no advisors. Just rain against the glass and a folder waiting on the table between us like something with teeth. Inside were documents restoring full, independent control of every account and asset that had ever technically belonged to Eli, and underneath them, a signed separation agreement. I stared at it longer than I meant to. "What is this?" "A choice," Nathaniel said, staying carefully on the other side of the table. "You could keep everything exactly as it is. Or you could leave, and no one follows you. Milo stays untouched, and everything already legally yours stays yours. And you're choosing to offer me that." "Yes." His voice softened in a way I hadn't heard from him yet. "I spent years thinking love meant keeping someone close enough that nothing could ever reach them. Preston used that against both of us. I helped build the exact system he exploited, one locked door at a time. I won't make your freedom into one more debt you owe me." I closed the folder slowly. "I need time. Take it." I turned toward the door. He didn't ask when I'd be back, which should have made leaving easy. Instead, I stopped halfway across the room. "Nathaniel." He looked up. I crossed back, and this time didn't reach for his wrist the way I had once before, on instinct, in a moment I barely remembered making. I reached for his face instead, slowly, giving him every chance in the world to step back. He didn't. "I don't know if what I feel belongs to Evan," I whispered, "or to me." His eyes closed for half a second under my palm, like something in him had been braced against this exact sentence for longer than he'd admit. "Then don't decide tonight," he said. "I thought men like you preferred immediate answers." "I used to." His hand covered mine, warm, careful, deliberate. "What do you like now? You having one for once," I said, and kissed him before either of us could think better of it. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a debt being paid or a rule being broken for the theater of it. It was quiet and a little uncertain and entirely mutual. Two people who'd both spent too long mistaking survival for something safer, finally figuring out the difference in real time. When I pulled back, Nathaniel didn't chase it. "Still leaving?" he asked, voice rough. "Yes." Something crossed his face. Pain, plainly, honestly. And he nodded anyway. "Then leave." I picked up the folder. At the door, I looked back. He hadn't moved from where I'd left him, standing in the rain-lit dark like a man who'd finally learned that the surest way to keep something was to stop trying to hold it too tightly. For the first time since I'd woken up in this life, an open door didn't feel like an escape route. It felt like a promise that if I came back through it, it would mean something. 3 weeks later, I woke up in a small rented apartment near the coast and realized Nathaniel had kept every single promise he'd made me. No guards outside. No car parked across the street pretending not to be there. No quiet, careful reports disguised as coincidence. Silence had meant danger for most of my old life. Here, it just meant Tuesday. I learned ordinary things badly, burned 2 pans worth of eggs, bought enough coffee to caffeinate a small precinct, and still, out of pure habit, mapped every exit in every coffee shop I walked into. Some instincts, apparently, survived dying twice. Others, like my brand new hobby of napping through entire Sunday afternoons, purely because I could, took to civilian life without any trouble at all. Milo visited most weekends, lighter every time, in the specific way people get lighter when they finally believe tomorrow actually belongs to them. Preston Vance was charged with fraud, coercion, falsifying records, and attempted poisoning. The evidence made any other story impossible, and he eventually took a plea deal that cost him his freedom, his fortune, and the entire network of favors he'd spent 12 years building. Nathaniel never once visited him. For a man who'd built his whole identity around being indispensable, I imagine being forgotten was the one consequence he never once prepared for. Nathaniel also, formally publicly, cleared Eli's name. Every internal note calling him unstable or disloyal, corrected. Every intercepted warning restored to the record. I read the statement alone in that little coastal apartment and cried harder than I had at my own funeral, which I hadn't technically been able to attend, and cried for Evan, the frightened, careful man who'd kept meticulous records and protected his brother and tried, over and over, to be heard by someone who finally, eventually, listened. "I hope you know," I told the empty apartment. "They believe you now." Nathaniel never once asked me to come back. He did, however, text, carefully, sparingly, like a man rationing something precious. "Milo says you make terrible coffee now. He's very worried about you." I sent back a photo of a genuinely tragic-looking omelet, and he replied within 30 seconds, which for a man who once made international shipping contacts wait 4 business days for a callback, felt like something close to a confession. 3 weeks turned into 6, turned into a habit I didn't examine too closely. A text about nothing important, a photo of a sunset over the harbor from his side, a photo of a sunrise over the water from mine, neither of us ever quite saying what we meant, both of us saying it anyway. He never once asked when I was coming back. I started slowly to understand that not asking was the whole point, that a man who'd spent his life learning love as control was teaching himself, one unhurried text at a time, an entirely different vocabulary. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I liked watching him learn it. 4 months after that, I drove up to a lake house he mentioned once, in passing, months earlier, the kind of detail a person only remembers on purpose. I found him behind it, fighting a wooden fence with far more determination than actual carpentry skill, sleeves rolled up, hammer in one hand, and a look of pure, focused frustration on his face that made him look, for the first time since I'd met him, almost human-sized. He looked up. He didn't move toward me until I took the first step. "Did someone tell you to come?" he asked. "No." His shoulders dropped visibly, like he'd been braced against a different answer. "Good. I'm not here because I need protecting, or because I owe you anything. I know, and I'm still not entirely sure I'm Evan." His face softened. "I know that too. That's good, actually, because I'm not." I stopped a foot in front of him. "My name was Daniel Reyes. This body belonged to Evan Parker before he became Eli Bennett. And somewhere between the two of them, I turned into someone neither one of them could have been on his own." Nathaniel set the hammer down, slow and deliberate. "What should I call you?" I looked out at the lake, silver under the late afternoon light, and thought about it honestly for the first time. "Eli," I said, "not because I'm pretending, because it's the life I'm choosing to keep." He waited, careful, patient, the way he'd learned to be. "And," I added, "before you get any ideas, that wasn't you deciding for me. I got there myself." He laughed, actual, unguarded, surprised, and I realized I'd missed that sound more than I'd let myself admit in 4 months of burnt eggs and mapped exits. "I'm staying," I said, "because I'm choosing to. That's the only reason I want it to be." "Then welcome home, Eli," he said, and this time when I stepped into the space between us, neither of us pulled back. Thanksgiving at the lake house smelled like cinnamon, coffee, and dinner rolls that Nathaniel had absolutely 100% burned while getting into a genuinely heated argument with Milo about a 4th and goal call from the Patriots game playing in the next room. "You can't just concede the point because you're losing the argument," Milo was saying, pointing a spatula at him like a weapon. "I'm not conceding anything. I'm choosing not to waste further resources on a losing position. It's a strategic retreat. That is literally what conceding means, Nathaniel." I leaned in the kitchen doorway, watching the head of what used to be one of Boston's most feared crime families lose a football argument to a college kid in a Boston College hoodie, and thought, not for the first time, that if you'd told paramedic Daniel Reyes he'd end up here, he'd have assumed you meant it as a fever dream brought on by too many overnight shifts. There were no guards outside the dining room that night. No hidden reports, no locked files, no quiet men pretending not to watch the driveway. Nathaniel had spent the last year quietly rewriting how the whole family handled protection until the word stopped meaning control and started meaning something closer to asking first. It suited him. It suited both of us. Milo was thriving at school and had, apparently, started seeing someone he point-blank refused to describe on the grounds, his words, that "you two are already embarrassing enough for one family." Earlier that afternoon, Nathaniel had attempted, for the second Thanksgiving in a row, to deep-fry a turkey in the backyard, and for the second year in a row, I had physically confiscated the propane tank from his hands the moment the oil started smoking. "I have run a multi-million-dollar shipping operation for 15 years, he informed me, with the wounded dignity of a man who has just been publicly overruled by his own husband in front of his brother-in-law. "And I have watched 3 different guys lose their eyebrows to a turkey fryer on the 4th of July, I said, dragging the tank a safe 6 feet farther from the house. "Trust me on this one. I've seen the burn unit paperwork. That's oddly specific. I contain multitudes. Mostly the multitude that would like to eat dinner without a trip to urgent care." Milo, watching from the porch with a beer he was fairly sure he wasn't quite old enough for, and which I chose, that day, not to notice, called out, "This is why we do the oven bird, Nathaniel. Every single year. We've talked about this." "The oven bird," Nathaniel muttered, "lacks ambition. The oven bird," I said, "has never once required a fire extinguisher, and won the argument by the simple, unbeatable strategy of walking the fryer into the garage myself while he was still composing his rebuttal. We ate the oven bird. It was, by unanimous vote, excellent, and Nathaniel spent the rest of dinner pretending he hadn't lost the argument at all, which had become, over the past year, one of my favorite things about him. The fact that underneath a decade and a half of quiet, terrifying authority, there was a man who sulked, gently and with tremendous dignity, over turkey. After dinner, snow started drifting soft and slow across the dark surface of the lake. Nathaniel came and stood beside me at the window with 2 mugs of hot cocoa, careful, as always, not to crowd me. Never assuming, always leaving the last inch of space up to me to close. "Home?" he asked, the same question he'd asked once before, a year and a lifetime ago. I looked at Milo laughing in the kitchen, at the warm light pooling gold across the snow outside, at the man beside me who'd spent a year proving, in 100 small, unglamorous ways, that love and control were not in fact the same language. I thought about Daniel Reyes, dying on a rain-slicked highway doing exactly the job he'd chosen. I thought about Evan Parker, standing outside a locked door, terrified nobody would ever believe him. And then I looked at the door behind us, unlocked, unguarded, entirely, deliberately open. "Home," I said. Nathaniel's fingers found mine, and I let them. I still clocked every exit in the room out of habit. I probably always would. But for the first time in either life I'd lived, freedom didn't mean running before someone could trap me. It meant knowing, with total certainty, that I could walk out that door anytime I wanted, and choosing, every single day, to stay instead. And that's the story. If you enjoyed this one, Follow the channel so you don't miss the next Mafia romance. New stories drop regularly, and I promise the next husband is just as much trouble as this one.